It was while I was driving through the vast yellow grass of the Great Plains that my life ended. I was on my way to see my parents who lived in a small town in western Iowa. The fastest route was straight down I-90 through South Dakota. I knew it was going to be a long and exhausting trip, 14 hours to be exact, so I made sure to pack plenty of snacks and drinks. I always hated stopping too often and making an already long road trip even longer. I know the first thing some of you are going to think is, why didn't you just fly? Well, if you're from any of the states in the middle of the country, you'd know that you never fly so long as your destination is on the same continent. But now, after all I've been through, I really wish I had flown. It's a mistake that I can truly say will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was on a particularly empty stretch of the interstate. There were no other cars on the road with me. None even driving westbound on the other side. Absolutely nothing to see, and I was used to it. I listened to a podcast about something I don't even remember and slowly slipped into a classic case of highway hypnosis. I don't know for how long, and I don't know what snapped me out of it. All I know is I got the sudden sense that something was off. I checked the usual suspects. My phone still had plenty of reception, and my car was at almost a full tank of gas. With those being the two things that usually snap you out of that interstate trance, I went back to doing nothing. Then I realized what wasn't there. I hadn't seen a single car in minutes. Obviously, that doesn't sound scary when I say it. It really wasn't, but it was very strange. I had gone an extraordinarily long time in the middle of the day on a Saturday without seeing a single car. My brain told me not to worry. That was perfectly ordinary and that I would see someone else sooner or later. Hell, maybe I saw a bunch of cars in the last few minutes and just zoned them out. But then I noticed something else that was missing. Something that I absolutely would have come across. Not a single exit. Not a single billboard. And once I began to pay attention, not a single mile marker, that's when my stomach got a little uneasy. When my brain started sending out some serious red flares. I grabbed my cell phone from its mounted charger and switched apps to my GPS. I had left it on in the background to occasionally check the time and distance left on my trip. If I stared at it the whole time, I would drive myself crazy, pun intended. But if I switched over every once in a while just to see the numbers go down, it was like a little treat. A tiny dopamine rush to get through the slog. But when I switched to the app, I saw nothing on it but a straight line. No time until arrival. No distance to destination. Not even a road label on the line through the screen. I slowed the car to a stop and turned on my hazards. Then after a moment of hesitation, I pinched my fingers on the screen to zoom out and see, once again, nothing but a straight line. No matter how far out I went. It wasn't possible that I was on anything else but I-90. It made absolutely no sense that there were no drivers, signs, exits, or literally anything other than yellow grass fields. I got out of my car and looked around. I kicked at the pavement, which to me seemed completely ordinary. Then I realized that my phone probably just lost signal, and that's why my GPS app was acting up. I even chuckled to myself for being so dramatic as I looked to the top right corner of the screen only to see a full connection. A million thoughts ran through my mind. Some of them were less sane than others. I closed out the app and reopened only to be met with a pop-up that I'd never seen before. A no GPS connection. I double-checked, but obviously my location settings were still on. I hadn't touched them since I started my trip. I had no need to. Yet still, my phone couldn't place me. I dialed in my mom's number. My heart rate raised just slightly with every chime of the tone, but to my relief, I heard the familiar voice of my mother answering. We talked for a bit, and I told her what was going on. She laughed it off. It's very empty out there, you know. And those silly phones bug out all the time. Honestly, your generation puts too much trust in them. I rolled my eyes, but thought that maybe she was right. Was it really out of the question that my GPS app had a server failure? I told her I'd get back on the road and call her when I was closer. We said our goodbyes. For some reason, I felt it especially important to tell her that I loved her before hanging up. As I got back into the driver's seat, I remembered one of the other details that really unnerved me: no exits. Sure, it's the middle of nowhere, no billboards. Fine, a little out of character for the Midwest, but possibles. No mile markers, though. My brain's only logical justification was that when I was panicking earlier, time seemed to slow down, and what felt like forever was actually less than a mile. Yeah, it was a stretch longer than the road I was on, but it was the only possibility I could think of to ease my worries. So I set off, this time paying extra attention to my odometer point 1, point 2, point 3, point 5, point 10, point 15, eventually 50 miles. 50 miles without seeing a single green marker at the side of the road. I stopped my car again. I looked at my phone, which thankfully still had a full connection. Mom? Yeah, it's me again. No, I'm not any closer. Don't laugh, but this is really starting to freak me out. Would it be dumb to call the highway patrol? Just see if they can look out for my car? Yeah, okay. I'll call you back after. Goodbye. I love you, Mom. I called the highway patrol. To their credit, they sent people out despite how crazy I must have seemed. The lady on the other end asked me what mile marker I was near. I tried to explain to her that I couldn't find a mile marker, not a single one in over 50 miles. She asked me what the last town I remembered going through was. Murdo, I said. Then she told me to stay put and to turn on my hazards. I gave them the description of my car's make and model and hung up the phone. Just for a moment before I called my mother back, I stared off into the distance. Into the vast empty plains dot, I realized I saw no hills, no trees, no shrubs. I described the situation to my mom. I told her everything, and we talked for several hours about our plans when I arrived, about some drama between my mom and her co-workers, anything that would make my situation seem normal. We went on until I got a call from the highway patrol. What the lady on the other end of the line told me shot my anxiety past anything leading up to this point. As I stared into the cloudless blue expanse and at the sun in the middle of the sky, what was unmistakably that same noon on a Saturday, the lady said to me, "We're calling off the search for the night because of the dark and the storm. If you're still in need of assistance, please call back." I hung up the line, and I sat in silence. The dark, the storm. Eventually, I turned my car back on. The dashboard said 937. I had a half tank of gas now. That little orange needle bobbed ever so slightly back and forth as I thought. I made my decision and shifted into drive. Into and through the grassy median onto the opposite stretch of road. Wherever I was, however I got there, I knew I didn't want to go any farther into it. My best hope was to return the way I came. So I did. I drove. And I drove. And I continued like nothing was the matter until my music was interrupted by the jingle of a phone call. My dad, he told me it was nearly 10 a.m. the next day. He told me how my mother was hysterical, how the highway patrol couldn't find me. He asked me what I was doing, what my surroundings looked like. Were there any defining features? I told him straight. There was nothing. The sun hadn't moved, not an inch. The road never curved or dipped. There were no signs and no animals and no clouds in the sky. Not a single rocky bluff or lone cottonwood tree. Nothing but empty grassland, twin belts of gray asphalt to split it, and me doubt I told him that my gas was almost out, and I joked that he should bring me some more. My worry only worsened when my usually jovial father couldn't spare a chuckle. We talked for a while. He told me stories from my childhood. The first time we played ball. The first time he took me to work with him. I teared up when he told me how proud he was of what I had become. I had to stop the car. My throat was tight and nearly swollen shut from the sorrow. And then my mom took the call. She told me all about the day I was born. Every little detail. What time it was. How much I weighed. About what she ate for breakfast that day and how hard I was to deliver, but also about how worth it I was in the end. I could hear her sobbing as she told me she loved me. And I was a mess as I said it back. I told him I would call again in a moment, that I needed to get my bearings right. Then I drove until the little orange needle kissed the E. I stared at the haunting 0 on my dash, the number that told me how many miles I had left, and I coasted it out as long as I could until my car slowed to a stop that I didn't react. I just sat there, munching on a granola bar I had packed. Then I slipped into an uneasy slumber, and I awoke to the bright sun above me, into a car so sweltering I could have easily overheated. For a while I cooled down in a little sliver of shade on the side of my car. That's when I stared down at the pavement. I studied every minute detail, every crack and dip. There wasn't a single ant, no fly in the air, not any kind of bug. I emptied my car of all the food and drinks that I had, put it all in one of my duffel bags that I emptied of clothes that I no longer needed. As I slung the bag over my shoulder and continued my journey on foot, I realized that I had to take this last chance to warn anyone else point 100% battery. I left it on the charger as I drove because I knew deep down that once this device ran dry, I lost all connection to the outside world. Before this phone is dead, I will call every person I can think of. I will say my farewells. I will forgive what I can. I will hope to be forgiven. It's a better end than most get, I suppose. Maybe somehow my loved ones will get closure, though I doubt anyone will ever truly understand what has become of me. But I didn't want my mother to blame herself. I don't want her to live the rest of her life in grief, so I did call her back. I told her I'd found an oasis, cool water, so many animals to eat, so many trees to use. I told her that even though we'll probably never see each other again, that I will be alive and well over here. As I told her all those fairy tales while simultaneously staring at the same expanse of nothingness. We both knew I was lying, but neither dared say so. At this point, I am certain I will die. Will I go slowly from starvation or thirst? Or find a way to end it sooner? Will I cling to the last shred of life I have left? Fill my mouth with prairie grass? Slog on until the malnutrition takes me? I am not sure. My delusional mind still wants to debate. It wants to believe these are choices I won't have to make. But deep down, I know that's where this path will take me. Though I do not know where this cursed road leads, I do know where it will end. At least where it will end for me. And so now I write this all out. I write it as I sit in the center of the road, so far that even my car is now lost. I eat the last of my rations, and I leave you with one final message. Never take this road. Never follow it into the middle of nowhere. And if you must do so, pray that you do not end up where I have. I'm not saddened by the recent passing of my grandfather. Rather, I'm compelled to share the way I knew him best. I would not be here today if not for him. The entity came for me when I was 8 years old, and there was no way I would have survived if anyone else had been driving. My grandfather and I were on a fishing trip that day. My dad had intended to join us, but something had come up, so it was just the two of us for the first time. I was a little awkward around my grandfather because I'd never actually been alone with him. I'd always watched others interact with him, but had little to say myself because I was only 8. I was also in awe of how he was to my dad the way my dad was to me, namely a voice of authority. When my grandfather told me about the different types of fish and what baits to use, I listened like it was the most important thing in the world. It turned out to be a good thing that I took his words so seriously that acceptance would later save my life. It began very innocuously. As we walked through a small gorge to get back to the car from the prime fishing spot, I could hear my grandfather's voice echo from the high rock walls. While he packed things into the car, I had several minutes to wander around, and I used them to run back to that area and shout. Strangely, my yell echoed only feebly once, and then not at all. Scream as I might, I heard no reflection of the noise. I was too young at the time to really understand how impossible that was. I just assumed I was yelling wrong somehow, or that my grandfather had a special grown-up timbre that allowed his voice to echo while mine just dropped off. Still, it bothered me, and I eventually brought it up on the drive back. Everything about that moment became seared into my memory. It was 3:22 in the afternoon by the clock in the car's dashboard. The sky was mostly clear with traces of white, and my grandfather's eyes were wide orbs of alarm turned upon me while his white knuckles tightened around the wheel. "What did you say, boy?" "I asked how I can echo like you," I told him, suddenly afraid that I'd done something wrong. "I yelled and I couldn't echo. He didn't seem to find what he was looking for through the windows, but he did not seem reassured. Here. He leaned over and opened the glove box in front of me to pull out a bag of jelly beans. I smiled for a moment, but he was not giving them to me as a gift the way he'd intended. Eat them all. I held the bag in my hands. It seemed a massive feast. If I'd been left to my own devices, I might have eaten them all eventually, but not all at once. Why? Eat them all, boy, he said gruffly, his tone brooking no argument. I began stuffing the jelly beans in my mouth. He looked down and around, then at the back seat, then at his travel thermos and the cup holder between us. He thrust it into my hands to join the spilling bag of jelly beans. Drink this. All of it. I'm not allowed to have coffee, I told him. Mom, he cut me off. Your mother will understand. Drink it. I know it tastes bad, but down it all. His gaze refocused on something beyond me, and I turned my head to my window to see the forested hills rolling by at various apparent speeds based on their distance. The furthest hills out on the horizon hardly seemed to be moving at all, but I thought I saw a tiny little speck atop one. My grandfather gripped my shoulder with one hand. Drink, boy. Drink. And eat those jelly beans. You need the sugar and caffeine. It's going to try to make you fall asleep. Don't let it. To say I was scared then would be an understatement. No part of me thought this was a prank of some sort. He was too reserved and austere a man for that. The coffee tasted horrible, but I gulped it down until none was left. After that, I began swallowing jelly beans whole until they were all gone. I looked to my right. The speck in the distance was still out there, but now one range of hills closer. It was still tiny, but now held movement akin to something waving back and forth. I looked to my grandfather in askance. He in turn looked away from the thing in the distance to focus on my face. He breathed in through his nose and turned forward, determined in a way I had never seen him. His leg moved and the car began to accelerate. We'd already been going the speed limit on the empty highway. The sugar, caffeine, and fear began to have an effect on me. I remember my cheeks and forehead warming and my hands growing clammy. I asked, "What's going on?" "I'm scared." "Be scared," he breathed, his eyes on the road as he continued to hit the gas. I could see the needle passing 80. "That'll help keep you awake. This godforsaken thing, it came for your grandmother, and it started the same way." Just before a long drive, we noticed her voice stopped echoing. His face contorted into a furious mask. "The cars are a lot better now than they were back then. I won't let it get you." My back began forcefully pressing into my seat as he put the gas to the floor. I watched the needle pass 90, and then I looked out the window again. It was even closer, now visible as a silhouette of a man running up hills, between trees and over boulders parallel to us. It's still out there. I held onto my armrest and the door handle in terror as our car topped 100 miles an hour and began to shake. It felt like we were in a barely controlled projectile, far beyond any limit of safety, and I was terrified the highway would suddenly stop being empty and we would smash into a car or a truck ahead. But even through that overwhelming fear and adrenaline, a chill tiredness began seeping up my spine. My eyes began to feel heavy, and I blearily looked to my right. The shock woke me back up. Thought I was on the gravel shoulder of the highway now, completely visible as a black humanoid silhouette running at incredible speed alongside our car. In that moving pitch darkness, I could see lit pinpoints that made it feel as if I was gazing into the night itself. The afternoon sun burned in the sky above and behind it with no effect. Staring as its blurred feet began to pelt across the painted line at the edge of the road, I felt sleepy again. It was running parallel to us, but drawing ever closer. "Wake up!" my grandfather screamed, risking one hand off the wheel at 110 miles an hour to shake my shoulder. "It's trying to drain the life out of you. Wake up!" He jerked the car one lane to the left and still pressed into my seat by the acceleration. I stared down at the hypnotic dashes in the middle of the road. Bit by bit, black feet began landing between each dash, keeping pace with us. I remember the car shaking violently around me the way I imagined a space shuttle lifting off might around its astronauts. I know now we were crossing 120 and nearing the most the car could offer, but at the time, I was caught in watching the hypnotic dashes and stars in those void legs moving rapidly back and forth as it ran right up alongside the car and reached down with one hand to open the door. Wind blasted around me as the gale force of 120-mile-an-hour winds tore at my clothing and hair. Waking up halfway, I screamed, and my grandfather jerked the car to the left again as much as he could without going off the road. It didn't matter. The running silhouette held the door open against the wind with his star-filled arm and began preparing to leap into the car with us. The other arm gripped my neck, and the cold that it brought cannot be described with mere words. The closest I can come is to say that the vast speeds and forces of an antithesis cosmos hated me. Somewhere, ice and anti-life would rule, moving through emptiness at absurd velocities, and this thing was some small part of that undead will.
But it was not fully here.
It could only interact with us in certain windows. That's what I believe now. My grandfather gave the only shout of fear I would ever hear from him as the car seemed to be shaking apart around us. I looked left at the speedometer, found the needle to be unreadably far out into the red, and felt the heavy blanket of sleep fall over me as the silhouette grasped repeatedly, but failed to reach me. The door slammed shut, cutting off the wind. Inch by inch, we began pulling away. It ran furiously alongside, but the entity was just a tiny bit too slow. Between one moment and the next, realizing it couldn't get us, it vanished. We'd escaped it. I awoke in a hospital several days later. My grandfather told nobody the real story, of course, but the doctors had plenty of diversion. Somehow I'd been drained of a number of vital electrolytes, salt, and so on, and they chalked my coma up to some sort of severe dietary imbalance. But I knew the truth, and I've made sure to tell the people I care about the small piece of advice that my grandfather taught me. I don't care if it makes sense to you, just listen. It's out there still in the open lands of the Midwest, and it's probably always been there. It was just never a problem before we started bringing great speeds into our daily lives. People die every day by falling asleep at the wheel, and I know for certain that not all of those incidents are innocent. If your voice stops echoing, cancel your road trip. It's waiting for you.